During this upcoming weekend, the judging of the TDC Communication Design and Typeface Design competitions will be taking place. During that time, our judges will be selecting the best usage of typography and the best design of the letter form. Judges Night was created more than 10 years ago. It was based on the idea of having the judges, the Thursday preceding the competition, sharing their work and knowledge with the audience. Tonight is that night. And now I'd like to quote Sumner Stone. "The TDC is sublime. What more can be said? Such good energy. The typographic community has been so fortunate to have the club. Long live the club."
Before we get here, this august assembly consulted among ourselves, and we've sort of agreed on discussing one very interesting phenomenon that we all witness. Maybe we're not equally aware of what's going on, but we know that something is happening, and this something is not necessarily good. It is good, and it is not, you know. So it seems like there is a widening disparity developing between the typographies. The learned professional typography, the way we knew it, and the low personal communication typography. Think blogging, SMSing, tweeting, using all those wonderful handheld devices. The irony is, what people do using those devices, they do typography, whether we like it or not. And this is new. Typography, as we knew it, was always meant to be based on small things, nuances, half a point spaces, kerning, tracking, and things. And the new generation of those handheld devices, typographers, they don't see an issue. It's a non-issue to them. So my question to this panel, to myself, to everybody here, is this a real sea change happening? And if it is, does it affect the work of the type designer? And if it does, in what way, in what direction?
What we're hearing from Maxim, who knows much more about this than I do, but what we're hearing is something that I've heard all my life, which is the difference between the high and low, what your title slide was, that typography is art and this is crap, or the typography, or what we're trying to do with letter forms on the calligraphy side is art, and most typesetting is crap. And there's been difference of opinions about that, and a kind of resistance and fear that normal people will get a hold of these tools and all hell will break loose. Well, that actually is way too late. I think we're maybe 30 years too late on this one. But I actually feel this has all been good, that there's been a lag of quality all the way along. But I think it's great that people are beginning to understand some of the niceties and are being able to use fonts wherever they want. Ultimately, we'll see, if anything, a broader swath of stuff. It won't be so high. It won't be high and low. It'll be everything in between, and we'll see beautifully produced letterpress, curated or artisanal works, and we'll see fine calligraphy too. But then the regular folks will be setting type without even knowing what they're doing.
I'm not sure if we're going to be seeing a broader swath. It sounds to me like we're going to see a division between the high end, which will get even higher, people who can do case-sensitive periods, as Maxime mentioned, and the people who don't care because they're just texting. And in between, we're going to have a gulf. But I think that this is really probably the best time typographically in history, in terms of what we can do with type, the number of typefaces available, the cost of type. and the knowledge out there. I mean, it's scary. My students come in and tell me things that I didn't know.
The only thing that worries me about it at all is the loss of handwriting. I mean, as a skill of communication, because it is an intimate interface, I guess. You know, you're writing onto a substrate, and it's very low tech. It really needs a piece of charcoal or a stone. The volume of communication has increased. The pyramid or the cone, whatever you want to call it, has gone larger. Therefore, the tip has gone larger, and the volume in a cone increases, right? As the height increases or the width increases, so we have more crap at the bottom, but you also have more stuff at the top. Not as much, but in proportion the same, obviously. We've never had more opportunity and more good stuff to do, and people will be doing it. I am totally turned on by the choices and possibilities, but as I said, I do regret people not experiencing this incredible miracle that, my God, I could write thoughts down, and they would be there for, well, not forever, but for my parents to see or my peers or whatever. And that incredible experience now depends on a battery-driven machine. That's my only gripe. But I'm an old guy. Yeah. I'm sure the late Egyptians were, or the Greeks were crying the demise of tablets, their tablets. Oh my God, you can't scrape into clay anymore. What's this papyrus sheet coming up? Everybody can whatever next.
I vividly remember when dry transfer lettering came out, Letraset and Mechanorma and so on. I remember typographers throwing up their hands and saying it's all over. If a grocer can go down to the store and buy Letraset and make signs for his shop, it's over, guys. We better find something else. I remember when desktop publishing came out, my students at Yale were all saying, well, we'd better go and find some other job because obviously it's finished. Typography, it's all over. Actually, the opposite happens. More people who can express some taste, which they've never been able to do before. I mean, maybe they could change the golf ball on their typewriter, but once they have the opportunity to choose different fonts on their computer and so on, they become much more knowledgeable about it, much more interested.
In other arts, we've heard the same complaint, that music has been ruined by synthesizers. And there's those of us who like that kind of music, and they think that they're delighted that that's available, and a lot of people can get into it using software that never could have before. So I find there are big gaps here, but I think in the whole, it's fantastic. It's a wonderful thing.
In the 70s, there were maybe a dozen type designers in the world, and who made a living out of it because they were employed by a large corporation. And now suddenly there's thousands of kids out there who kind of make a living because they have their own website. I don't know how many foundries there are. I've lost count. There must be hundreds. And every morning I get another 3 emails from somebody, oh, here's my new founder and here's my new typeface. And they don't usually look like they may ever threaten Helvetica or Arial from first place, but they're there and somehow they make a living. So there must be a demand for it. I mean, somebody buys that stuff or downloads it or rips it off, which is another form of compliment.
I think that the general level of type design is so much better than it was at the phototype era. I mean, remember Alpha Type, the local typesetter, or even photo lettering. There was an enormous amount of crap that came out with really bad spacing and odd designs, and then those of us who didn't have the money to buy photo lettering typesetting would get a CompuGraphic machine. Never mind the smell of the thing. They created some of the worst type that's ever been seen. But the thing is that I think that the general level is vastly better in the amount of sophistication. When you see these young foundries that show up, their sense of balance and letter form and kerning and spacing is vastly better than we could have done with Fontographer 1.0, and I tried too.
All these developments, do you think they somehow affect the way you see the priorities in type design? Say, let's take you, Roger. You inspire people to develop typefaces for the dying media. Magazines and newspapers. So what is the new challenge? Does the new development affect the priorities in type design, or changes the threshold? How do you feel about it?
The sort of current excitement, if that's the right word, is open type. And we've referred to that. And it's nice that script faces can now have 17 different lowercase s's or something or other, you know. But as far as basic Roman and Italic in the Latin script, I think it's a fad. It's a fad like QuickDraw GX or multiple masters or various other things that kind of came and went, you know. The type business historically has made its money by reselling the same typeface over and over again as different fonts. Founders type wore out, you had to go buy it again. Linotype matrices wore out, go buy it again. You bought your fonts for your liner film phototype setter. When you upgraded to a VIP, you got the same typefaces, different fonts. They couldn't be used on different machines. Same when you upgraded to the Linotron. Then came PostScript, for Christ's sake. It works on every machine. And I had an email from Matthew Buderick the other day. He wrote a thing saying, he and I worked on a typeface together 20 years ago, and he'd never looked at it since. It took him about 10 seconds to find it in his archive, 10 seconds to install it, 10 seconds to run a proof, and it was perfect. I mean, how can you make a living as a type designer if 20-year-old fonts are still working just fine? You know, it's ridiculous. It's never happened before in the history of all of this. So along comes OpenType, which was an attempt to persuade people to buy the same typefaces again in a different font. And, you know, maybe I'm sure anyone who's in this business gets calls from well-established clients saying, we're told we've got to change our typefaces, our fonts to OpenType, and you say, why? And they, well, I don't know, we've been told we've got to do it. Do you have cross-platform issues? No. Do you want to add a whole lot of characters to? No. Are your PostScript faces still working all right? Yes. So what, you know, I don't know where this will end up. I mean, obviously, outside the Latin world, it's had huge implications, as almost all technical advances in the last century have done and continue to do. For, you know, Arabic and you should see Scott Kosofsky's pointed Hebrew. I mean, it's just nothing like that has been possible before. But the part of it that I rather regret is that the OpenType tools are not very good. And there's been a sort of division of labor between designers and the people who can do all the OpenType stuff, you know. And I'm rather nostalgic for the 90s when everyone was their own Fournier. You could do everything you needed. Anyone could do everything and produce a professional quality font with all of the amenities that then existed. That's sort of gone away now. And a lot of people who have specialized in, you know, taking data from people like me and turning them into OpenType fonts are getting really sick of that and, you know, find something else to do. So where this is all going to end up in the Latin world, I'm not really sure. And when I look at that typeface that John Hudson did, I think you have to realize that for every one person that looks at a font and says, yummy, 17 different S's, you know, there are 10,000 people that look at that font and said, get it away from me. I just want one S and I want it right, you know. Don't bother me with this. So it's a mistake to think that because a technology will do something, is able to do something, that it will do that in practice. You know, I remember when photocomposition became a reality, there were wonderful articles saying, you know, now that type is no longer three-dimensional, it's now two-dimensional. We're not constrained by little rectangular section pieces of metal, which have to be lined up in a straight line. Type now is flexible. You know, we can do wavy lines, we can go round and round, we can do spirals and so on. And people started to do that for about a month. Then it occurred to people that type isn't rectangular. You know, it's not, type isn't in straight lines because type is rectangular. Type was rectangular because it has to be in straight lines. So everyone went back to putting type in straight lines again. Forgot about all of this stuff and so on, you know. So we go through these cycles over and over again. I mean, these technical advances come along, and as I say, in the non-Latin world in particular, they can be extremely significant. And people are always looking for ways in which they will improve our lives in the Latin world. But it's not ever very plain to me that they really will do this.
Haven't we arrived at the same point that other forms of expression have arrived, like, say, music? I mean, we have, depending which scale you count, say, we have 8 notes, give and take, right? We just look at our regular Western musical system. We have 8 notes, and we've had different music for the last 1,000 years, say, or maybe 800 is stuff we can listen to. You can still listen to the Beatles from the 70s, 40 years ago, it still sounds modern, but it hasn't stopped anybody from inventing new music all the time. And of course, I'm at the age where, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, I stopped listening to new stuff. I'm very much like, I used to be with my parents who say, oh yeah, this is all crap, give me the 70s again. I think all of us do the same. We do the same with type. There's certain stuff that we started liking in our formative years, and certain stuff that happens today I tend to ignore. So essentially we've entered, apart from the obvious hardware issues and the lack of market that Matthew describes, we've entered the fashion industry. We supply a demand because things are different. This year's typeface will not survive probably. You don't set out to design a classic in the first place. Like Matthew, I come from a background where I don't have a typeface coming on in the morning. I design something because somebody wants it for a certain purpose, more often, well actually always. But we are supplying a demand for pop. Type now is become pop music.
The idea that somebody would want a website that looked like them and didn't look like every other website gets really interesting. And I think that's the market that's beginning to happen. That we're doing fonts that are custom, that create personality. And there's sort of 2 parts of this. In the beginning, it's going to be the corporate, the big publishers, the big names, and then a movie or a TV show or a TV network, and those kinds of big arenas. But very fast, it's going to get into individuals, and we're seeing it. We're seeing people begin to understand enough about typographical controls that they can communicate, and it gets back to what we were talking about in the beginning.
The idea of individuals getting their own personal thing has already been happening since the 90s, when you had companies that would digitize your own handwriting, so that you would have your own personal look, but through the computer.
My question to all of us is whether there is anyone in the audience who would like to take advantage of this group being on stage to ask some questions.
As luminaries, do you guys ever get tempted to maybe write a book about stop stealing sheep, but don't worry so goddamn much about the small capital italics?
No, you know what? We do whatever we do, and we do it 120%, because the result will only be 80% anyway. That goes for everybody. I mean, have you ever been to, say, this sort of event for brain surgeons or chefs or car mechanics? They're just as nerdy as we are. They nerd out on, whatever vein that runs through there, or whatever diameter of gear you need to drive this shaft or whatever. These guys nerd out just as much as we do. And we think I sometimes think we're totally crazy talking about whatever, a 1,000th of a unit, or this weight or that weight, or 25 versions of this character, or the 17 S's that Matthew mentioned. We nerd out, and that's what we do. Everybody nerds out as much as we possibly can. And because everybody does it in their job, that's why the word works.
We do it because that's what makes us professionals and not amateurs.
That's what I'm saying, exactly, that's it. We go 120% or we go to 11, I should say, that's what we do.
But there is an interesting thing here in printers in the good old days. Good printers had house styles where they would have a particular and very strongly voiced internally idea about how much space goes before and after a colon, and where how much letter space you add to small caps and things like that. And they would be they would be dogmatic about it. And if you were in those shops, if you're working for a particular printer, you couldn't diverge. You would have to set it over again. And I think there are typographers today who have that kind of regimen, but I'd like to see more of it. The idea that you could see in a particular body of copy a little bit of text. Oh, I know who said that. And too much. When I started in graphic design, typography was. It was the era of the type directors, where type was sort of specced out. It was either in a publication, you didn't really have too much choices, or you had a very limited number. And you would see art directors would do layouts where the text was just a gray rectangle, or it would be some squiggles with it, the magic marker. And now it's different. People actually set type, and I think there are you see in certain magazines and certain corporate designers, you can start seeing their style working, and I love that there's more and more voice beginning to happen, and a feeling about the way spacing should happen, or what, which fonts are appropriate and stuff. And I think that that's sort of, that's where I see those rules happening, people making their own rules.
I have the most basic question. What is everyone's favorite typeface?
The ones I am fond of, I can explain with my biography. The first one I ever had in metal, when I was an apprentice. I hated Bodoni at the time, I really hated it, and that's probably because I had to set these sort of little not classified, but small ads that were usually about funerals, because people were dead to use Bodoni, at least then, when I learned in the 60s. Well, it was the most...
Is that cause or effect?
It was the posh typeface they had, and everything else was sort of kind of like Futura, Airbar, and, the German block typefaces. And I love block to this day because you couldn't destroy it. It was pre-destroyed. It had irregular outlines, and it looked like sort of German wholemeal bread, which I also tend to like. So that's my biography. I will never get away from that stuff. It was like, your first teddy bear or your first kiss or whatever. You will always remember that. And I remember my first typefaces. But I don't have a favorite because I work for clients.
I'd say my favorite is Trump Medieval, but the face I use all the time is Frutiger. Frutiger is great on screen. It's great for everything you do.
It is what Helvetica always wanted to be.
I use, whatever I feel is appropriate, but it's not that I want to leave a mark, and I feel personal regarding the choice of typeface, that's all. It's a matter of convenience only.
Right now, it's Benton Sans RE for the default in InDesign, because it reads incredibly well. It's huge. I love it.
I know you were discussing tonight about kind of this evolution of all these handwritten fonts and things that are more decorative. What are you guys' thoughts on the trends going on with typefaces that kind of aid in improving people's lives, such as developing typefaces for maybe like a road sign, or making a typeface for e-readers to help you read better? Like, what are your gentlemen's thoughts on kind of the trends that are going on, like how it's affecting it?
The attempts to measure the legibility of type go back a long way. There's a long history of this. It's been sincerely done, and I don't mean to say that it was all a waste of time. But, this is not the place to get into it all. But I think that we're sort of on the verge, because people now understand so much more about the brain, the way the brain works, how our eyes work. There are tools that can measure things like eye movements and so on in a way that's never been possible before. It may be possible soon to sort of take the cognitive elements out of the study of legibility, which is what's bedeviled it always. And, I'm speaking sort of a little ahead of the game here, but I think that people like myself, who've always been very cynical about legibility research, may have to sort of think again fairly soon, and perhaps see some information that we might begin to find interesting. So I think that, sort of next generation of type designers may have some data to work with that we have not. I mean, like Erik, I get commissioned to do fonts for signs and that sort of thing, and I give them my best shot, and I test them sort of seat of the pants, you do what you can. But I'm aware that I can't back this up with any scientific data. And I'm not saying you ever will be able to do that completely, find one single typeface which everyone knows scientifically is more legible than everything else. But I think there may be some useful... But I think there may be some useful data coming along, because there are behavioral psychiatrists, psychologists and so on, who have very useful information starting to come online about all of this.
Going back to Roger's point about the future of fonts and how everybody will be able to purchase a font and email, is that almost like we're opening Pandora's box to an extent?
Do you ever go to the opera? Probably not. A few people go, and it's heavily subsidized. So are we going to outlaw it because not many people go? Who are we to say? No, but seriously, I mean, it's a cultural expression. And the last thing, I do remember when I was in my 20s, I wanted to become Minister of Typography for Germany, outlawing certain misuses and setting certain standards. Now I realize that was a totally fascist idea. I mean, who am I to tell people what to use or not to use? I have my own standards, and I teach my students, and I certainly have opinions. And I have the poor people in my studio who suffer from my preferences or prejudice, as it were.
The Federal Bureau of Typography.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great idea, but it's a dumb idea. I mean, who am I to say? And you know, either you believe in a free society and we do it, or you vote Republican.
I find that fine. I think that the idea that if you give people the tools to use type for their messaging, for their emails, or for their any kind of personal correspondence they end up doing, great. And if they can choose a font from an API, from a list in the menu, great.
I strongly agree with what both Erik and Roger said about that. You know, we go through these cycles. Early days of desktop publishing, we saw a lot of ransom note typography, and it was really terrible, but it didn't last very long. People learned from their mistakes. No doubt we'll see the same thing on the web as many, many, many web fonts come along. We're seeing it, you know. And the example that the questioner gave, I think, is rather similar. I'm not in favor of the font police, you know. I think
several of you have won various awards that are pretty prestigious awards, and they're kind of recognized in the national sphere. And especially lately, there's been a lot of kind of publicity around type and typography. And I'm curious if you think kind of all this focus on type and typography outside of our kind of little nerdy room here is worth all the kind of, in the grand scheme of things, is it really that important? Or do you think that it deserves more credit than it gets, you know, in the general sphere?
Nick is right that there seems to have been more willingness just recently to consider type design on a par with other kinds of industrial design, is really what you're saying. I do feel that type design deserves to be considered on a par with other kinds of industrial design and so on. And I'm very pleased when I see curators and librarians and design authorities doing that. And it's taken them a long time. And, you know, there have been a lot of things that contributed. I think the Helvetica movie did a lot. And, you know, a number of other good things have happened. It's been a good couple of years for type design, I would say.
Speaking of appreciation, we certainly do appreciate your coming here and asking all these questions. Isn't this wonderful to have such a team of judges? On our common behalf, I would like to wish those who entered their works in this competition good luck. It's tough. I mean, judging such a contest is challenging in its own way, and a lot has been submitted. So I hope a lot of good would come out of it. Thank you. Have a wonderful 2012. Right. All right. Thanks again.